Hi, my name is Bill McCamley. I'm a former state representative from New Mexico. I'm going to start a podcast called What the Bleep Does That Mean, where I take some fairly complicated policy things that we might be talking about in our communities or in the country and hopefully help explain them in a way that folks can understand. I know a lot of times these complicated issues, people use really, really big words and all sorts of jargon, and it makes it a pain in the rear end to understand. So I'm going to start trying this thing. And the one I want to talk about today is immigration. So we have a new president coming in starting tomorrow. And in his previous term and during the last campaign, he talked about how he wants to do mass deportations and throw a lot of people out of the country. I want to talk about a little bit about immigration, a little bit of historical context, and what it means for you if this does go through. So first, let's talk a little bit about history. Um, this is not a new thing, right? The first law regarding immigration in the United States was in 1795. It only required 5 years of residency before you could be a U.S. citizen. In 1798, so just 3 years later, it required 14 years of residency, and then it returned back to five just another couple of years after that in 1803. In the 1850s, there was a group called the Know Nothing Party. It was basically formed to protest Catholic and Irish influence. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, Scorsese film, there was a guy in there named Bill the Butcher, and he was a real guy. So this was a real movement. They just didn't like Catholics. They certainly didn't like the Irish, people like my ancestors. And they actually got a lot of political power. They had the majority of the Massachusetts legislature. They had a congressman elected, and they wanted to throw everybody out. Further, in the 1800s, in 1882, 92, and 1917, he had a bunch of laws against the Chinese. The first one was actually called the Chinese Exclusionary Act. And the one in 17 actually created an Asiatic barred zone where it says any kind of workers couldn't come from Southeast Asia or India or anywhere in the Middle East. These racial barriers, which are, as you can probably understand, a constant theme for immigration, were not actually stopped until 1952. And then throughout the next decades, you see different stuff. In the 40s, spouses and children of World War II soldiers were allowed to become citizens. Cubans were allowed citizenship on an expedited basis in the 60s, Vietnamese in the 70s after our war there, Central Americans, Haitians in the 90s. So you see this ebb and flow of immigration where people get really worried about it for a whole host of reasons, a lot of it based on race. And then they say, hey, immigration's really, really good, so we should let them back in. And it goes up and down and up and down. So where are we at today? So we had 12.2 people living here undocumented in 2007. That was the high. This actually decreased over the past few years until 2021, mostly under the Obama administration, of all things, about 10.2 million. And it's increased slightly since 2021 to about 11 million folks now. Interestingly enough, Mexican immigrants have generally been the highest amount of undocumented folks, and that's still the case, but it's fallen way down since the early 2000s, where most people now are actually coming from Central America and India. About 8.3 million workers in the US are undocumented. That's basically the population of New York City. 6.3 million households have at least one undocumented person in there. And 70% of those homes include a person who is here legally. So this is mostly the homeowner or the spouse. About 4.4 million US kids under 18 live with an unauthorized immigrant parent. And globally, you're seeing immigration becoming even a bigger deal because people are moving from poor areas of the world, Central America, Africa, Southeast Asia, to places where there's a higher standard of living. Europe, North America, Australia, that sort of thing. Why are people coming here to the United States? Gang violence is one of the biggest issues. In Central America, it's very, very intense. The Americas, so all of us in North and South America, have the highest murder rate of any region in the world. So Haiti averages about 40 murders per 100,000 people. It's one of the highest in the world. Honduras is at 32. And as a comparison, in the United States, we have about 5.7 murders per 100,000 people. Canada has only about 2.3 murders per 100,000 people. So it's much safer to live here. Then you move on to economic opportunity. So the per capita income of India, remember Indians are some of the higher amounts of undocumented folks we have here in the United States now, it's $10,000 a year. In Guatemala and Central America, where a lot of folks are coming in, $5.7 thousand a year. As a comparison, here in the US, our per capita income per capita income is $82,000 a year. And then you look at climate change, increasing floods and drought, forcing a lot more people to move. Again, this is happening worldwide, but it produces a chain effect. And I'll give you an example. In El Salvador, it's been documented, scores of folks leave their rural villages every year because of a crop failure from drought or flooding. And they end up in cities in El Salvador where they become victims of this gang violence and all the stuff going on there. And they ultimately flee those countries to come to places like the United States because of those attacks. So you got a lot of reasons that immigration is happening. Now, what does it mean for prices? And this is really interesting because a lot of people voted for the Republican administration that's going to be taking power tomorrow, in the White House at least, because they were worried about the economy and inflation, how prices have gone way up. Well, if we were to have a mass deportation program, first let's talk about the cost. The American Immigration Council estimates that the one-time cost of operations to try to deport all the folks that are here illegally would be $315 billion. Now, what is that the equivalent to? About 4,000 F-35 fighters that the Air Force might want, or about 29 million people on Medicaid. That is what $315 billion roughly would fund. So the current U.S. prison population is only about 2 million people. And that's really why it explains if you want to take 11 million people, try to lock them up and get them out of here, then that's like 5 times the amount of people that we currently have in prison. In 2022, undocumented immigrant households also paid $46.8 billion in federal taxes and another roughly $30 billion in state and local taxes because most of them are actually working. And so if you kick all these folks out, you're going to lose about $30 billion in state and local tax revenue and about $47 billion in federal tax revenue. And you're going to lose some Social Security. So undocumented folks who are here contributed about $22.6 billion to Social Security and $5.7 billion to Medicare. And that becomes even more important as people worry about Social Security becoming insolvent as not working in the next 10, 20 years. So if we kick all those folks out, that date probably comes a little bit sooner than it would have otherwise. And now let's talk about prices. So home construction, home prices in terms of buying a home or rent, that was one of the big price issues people had in the election. Well, in Texas, where I just moved back from, about 50% of construction workers are undocumented. And rents in Texas are averaging $200 more a month here in 2025, early 2025, than they were in 2019. 31% of construction workers nationally are undocumented. And so Jim Tobin, who's the executive director of the U.S. Association of Home Builders, said, and I quote, "Anything that threatens to disrupt the flow of immigrant labor will send shockwaves to the labor market in home construction." Long story short, if we start getting rid of all the people that are doing this work, they're building these homes, who is going to put these new things up that will then lower the cost of rent because it's a supply and demand issue? Basically, not many, and then your rent's going to go up if that happens. Now let's talk about food. 1.7 million ag workers in the U.S. are undocumented. And that's both direct agriculture, hey, I'm out in the field picking lettuce or whatever, and food processing, like working in a dairy or working in a meat processing plant. The share of meat packers in the U.S. that were foreign born, about 45%, so almost half of every single person working to produce your chicken, your beef, your fish, is not here legally. 90% of dairy workers in Idaho were actually born outside the United States, and they produce 15 billion pounds of milk per year. Texas A&M estimates that eliminating immigrants from dairies would double milk prices. About 75% of farm workers in California are undocumented, and they produce out there a third of the vegetables grown in the United States and 3/4 of the fruits and nuts that you go get in your grocery store. Again, if you kick all these folks out, not people aren't going to be there to pick the lettuce. They're not going to be there to gather the nuts. They're not going to be there to make your milk. And the price of groceries will increase. Now let's talk about a couple other things. Restaurants. 1 in 12 of the country's 10 million restaurant workers were living in the United States illegally. Childcare. 142,000 childcare workers in the U.S. are undocumented. So if you think going out to dinner costs a lot of money, or restaurants aren't able to serve you, or you worry about the price of childcare, which is a big deal throughout the country, Kicking out a bunch of folks that are undocumented are only going to make those costs go up, and the availability of seats at a restaurant or a place for your kid to get taken care of, they're not going to be as high, right? Um, Let me just close this on a personal story. So in 2017, I was still state representative. It was the first or second week of February, and the previous Republican administration had ICE come in, and we're doing door-to-door raids for undocumented immigrants in my hometown of Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I get this message from a middle school teacher at Picacho Middle School, 8th grade. She had this kid come in, 13 years old, was crying uncontrollably, and I get this Facebook message saying, "Bill, I don't know what to do. I think there's raids going on." And I found out a couple of weeks later what happened. ICE came into my hometown. They were in a trailer park where they were going after some folks. They had a list of folks that were supposedly doing drugs or bringing human smuggling operations over. But they had a long leash, and they were waiting outside this guy's house from 4 to 6 a.m. in the morning. No one came out, but there was another guy 3 doors down who was just coming out of his house at 6 in the morning, going to work, and they talked to him, found out he was here undocumented. They took him and deported him. And that little girl, who was 13 years old, is might not ever see her father for a while. Now, I find that morally problematic, but also these are folks that are, as we talked out, they're working in the farm fields, they're working in the restaurants, they're helping take care of your kids. These are important jobs that a lot of people who want to come here want to help us get done. And deporting everybody because of some reasons that we're not fully aware of, that might have some unintended consequences. So as this starts moving forward, just some information you might want to have as they're probably going to start moving forward with these programs. Anyway, again, my name is Bill McCamley. Appreciate you listening to this. Hope everyone's having a good weekend and staying warm out there.